Hello, everybody at MacEwan University in Canada. My name is Oliver Laasch. I'm the author of the textbook Principles of Management, Practicing Ethics, Responsibility, and Sustainability. And I understand that this is the very textbook you are actually using for your class. So it's a genuine pleasure to get to know you folks and hopefully to also engage a little bit more in the discussion that we will have in your class a little bit later on after you watch this video. The topic of this video is one that I believe is extremely timely, very important at the moment, in particular because, so there comes the spoiler, it's supply chain management. So that doesn't sound too exciting, but it is very, very timely because what we're seeing nowadays in many areas of the world is actually that supply and demand are not being met or not being matched properly. We do have a fuel crisis in the UK at this point in time. Not too long ago, we had a global interruption of the food supply chain because of a large ship that was getting stuck in a canal. So how can those kind of things actually happen? And what is the consequence of those kind of things happening? Because we really depend on supply chain management to get the things that we need to us. This is one part of the story. The other part of the story, of course, is that supply chains or supply systems are the largest contributors to some of the worst problems we have on this planet. If you're thinking about the CO2 impact of our consumption, a very large proportion of that is related to the supply chain. The other large part is our own use of the products, and actually the production itself, which most companies are focusing on, how to produce it more environmental friendly or more socially responsible, is a very small part of it. So we have to shift our emphasis on of sustainability, responsibility, and ethics more towards the supply networks, the chains, the systems that our activities in the organizations where we are managers are relating to. So let's have a look at how we could actually do this. And the first case I would like to quickly introduce is the one of TETRA PAK. TETRA PAK is a very present company around the world because a large number of our food products are actually packaged in their Tetra Pak boxes. At the same time, we probably don't think about the company itself very often because it's just the packaging, if you want. So the packaging itself is of course part of the supply chain. But at the same time, the question is really, what does that packaging do throughout the different parts of its life cycle? So what kind of impact does it have when it's being produced, but then also what kind of impact does it have while it's being used? So for instance, being able to keep things fresh longer and doing so without other ways of preserving the food that's within it, which would be more energy intensive. Of course, it's also part of the environmental impact of that packaging. But very interestingly, Tetra Pak actually has a goal of becoming planet positive. So that's actually a very impressive and maybe almost illusionary, impossible goal. But at the same time, that's a goal that we need for most companies. Because the idea is that if we are just a little bit less bad, so if we are a little bit more sustainable, so having a smaller negative impact, still we're having a negative impact, and overall we're going to wipe ourselves off the planet in the long run. Planet positive, on the other hand, helps us to be restorative, so to actually have a positive impact, to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, to leave water cleaner than we found it. But also social and economic positive impact. So this is the idea of something like planet positive. And one of the key aspects of that is that holistic perspective of the entire supply and demand network. And we'll talk more about what that actually means. And the other core aspect of that is something that we call circularity. So how can we actually make sure that just like in nature, resources go in circles? It's not that resources just are being used, wasted, and thrown away and disappear out of the system. No, the idea is that they're being used in circles, and because of that, they can be used endlessly. This is the idea of a circular economy. So how do we get there? Supply chain management itself is really well positioned to get to that kind of goals, because it is managing those networks of supply and demand. And if we actually take a perspective of professional supply chain management, and with professional, I mean a type of supply chain management that fulfills a positive role on this planet and in society, then we're actually very, very close to finding solutions to many of the issues that we have nowadays. And we will discuss that in 3 different areas of the supply chain management process. So first of all, we will think about how can we understand the chain, respectively, the network better, because if it's circular, it's not a chain anymore. It is something that's much more interconnected, going back and forth, that's iterative and so on. Then about managing from the inside, because depending on where you are in that supply and demand network, you might actually have very different means, very different practices of managing circularity and to make a supply and demand network more sustainable. And then the closing the loop part, an emphasis on how do we actually get this done? How are we able to make sure that the resources, the value we set, supply chain management there about is about value and value creation and destruction, or value creation and consumption. So how do we actually make sure that value creation and consumption are happening in a closed loop way, where we're not losing value overall, but we're just passing it on from one to the other. This is the idea. So let's look at those 3 areas real quick. Understanding the supply chain. So value creating and value depleting activities, that's what you said before. So this is what a supply chain, if it's linear, or a supply system, if it's a circular one, does. So it is a complex adaptive system. Whatever I do over here somehow also triples through and affects what's being done over here. So if you've changed in consumption, so consumption, as you will see, is part, of course, of the supply and demand network of the supply chain. So if you have a change in consumption, let's say, so for instance, people consume more soybeans. Okay, well, of course, that needs to have a change over here where soybean production happens. So, but also in more subtle ways. So if there is an increasing awareness that soybean production actually is competing with other natural land uses, which again have very negative impacts on the CO2 side of things, well, then we actually might have to change the way how soybean production is happening. For instance, from being a monoculture towards a polyculture, where you connected more naturally with the original land use of where that is being produced. So the idea is that this complex adaptive system is what supply chain managers are in charge of. And very often that actually goes wrong. So think about what happened during the COVID pandemic. So this is where supply chain management was the very, very basic function that management with which management would have been able to very, very positively impact the society. And probably supply chain managers around the world did their best in order to do that, and to make sure that this does not happen, that we do not have that we do not have supply shortages, or that we are able to keep up with demand. And supply chain management can actually also mean, as we've seen in the COVID crisis, that kind of impulsive kind of hoarding buying behavior, where you get where all of a sudden there's no toilet paper anymore, that you are, as a supply chain manager, actually work together very, very closely with the people in marketing, customer relationship management, which shape and form demand as well. So it's not only about how to get the stuff there, it is about the entire system of somehow bringing supply and demand together and making it meet, so that we do have the things we need available. This is the idea. And in order to do that, we need to have that holistic view of the entire system. So it means not only to think about who am I as a company, so the focal company, as we say down there, but also to see what is happening upstream, where my inputs come from, or where my labor comes from, if you're more in a service type of world, but also downstream, where does it go? And not only going into that one direction from left to right, where you're saying, okay, it comes from here, it goes to there, and then it's going to stay over there, and somebody's just going to throw it away. No, we actually also thinking beyond that first supply chain. We're thinking about second order supply chain. So when things are being sold secondhand, for instance, or if things are being refurbished and they're being sold as almost new, or also if the same product or its packaging even has another use completely different from the original products. Those are those N-order supply chains. And the idea is that we are finding ways of actually going from right to left, from moving back towards the left. So the idea is that then somebody like a revalorizer over there, all the way at the end, is an organization or some kind of entity that helps you to add value back to something that's already been depleted. Remember, value depleting and creating activities are being connected in the supply chain. And a really, really interesting example I came across the other day is a shopping center in Sweden, which is located right next to the city's recycling center. So the recycling center usually is just kind of taking things apart, separating them into different materials, and getting them back to the original kind of first step of producing something new with it. But this is actually very clever. Right next to that recycling center is that shopping center, and the shopping center exclusively sells things that have been used before. And that could be that somebody threw something away, and just the very same way that they threw it away, it can still be resold because it's perfectly fine. But also, many of the shops in there were actually that kind of crafty DIY shops where somebody built something new from pieces of other things that had already been thrown away. So imagine that, an entire shopping center, large shopping center, more like a mall really, that is entirely based on recycling, revalorizing the things that otherwise would have been thrown away and gone to the tip. So that's something I find very encouraging. But also, if you're merely looking on the resource side of things, there's this idea and practice of the industrial ecosystem where the waste of one producing, value creating or value adding entity actually is the input of another one. So we are eliminating waste. This is the idea. So another way of making it circular, where already in the during the production phase, we're making sure that nothing goes to waste, quite literally. Anything that we have that comes out of one production process will be the input of another production process. And that's why it's called an ecosystem, because also in ecosystems, in natural biological ecosystems, nothing goes to waste. But that's just one out of many techniques. So think about sustainability clusters, or for instance, different companies focusing on, let's say, vegan food production, which find synergies with each other. Think about sustainable value chains. So a single product, all of whose production and dissemination stages are managed in order to have a positive, a restorative triple bottom line. Or think about sustainable industry. So think about electric cars, for instance, trying to get rid of the traditional combustion engine, or hydrogen cars. Think about a sustainable community where we actually not focused on the industry, on the commercial aspects of things, but more about how community life is organized. So you might have local food producers, for instance, who share, just as in the olden days, who share their produce on a local market, and it's being produced locally. And at the same time, the waste once again goes back into a compost, producing fertilizer that goes back to the production activities. So that's another way of organizing economy, so more of a community economy, a local community economy. So we can get to that idea of sustainability, or even restorative sustainability, a net positive impact, in many different ways. But of course, it needs to be done very well. Typically, it's very drastic, very deep changes, and often doing it on a superficial level, as it happened with Zara here, is exactly the very problem that why people say, oh, it can't be done, because just saying, well, we are actually having those transparency and traceability policy, but then not acting up on it in detail in every instance of your own supply chain, gets you in enormous trouble. So it needs to be done very thoroughly and very, very deeply. That's one of the main points there. And one of the ways of how to get there are the 6 T's of sustainable supply chain management. And I won't go through all of them right now because you have them in the book anyway, but I want to highlight traceability and transparency. So the idea is that you're not only putting out a policy of, look, this is how we want to do things, and then you tell your suppliers and ask them to please do it. No, you need to be able to transparently see what's been done where, and you need to be able to trace back each and every one of your products and each and every one of your suppliers in a way that allows you to reach that transparency. So those are two of the key principles of sustainable supply chain management. So how do you actually do that if you are working in a company inside the supply chain? And that could be anywhere in that system, in that supply and demand system. You could be a company that is extracting raw materials if you are in a supply demand network, which is product based, so physical product based. But you could also be a company on the very opposite end and talking about how can we actually revalorize things. So how can we recycle, or how can we upcycle things? How can we refurbish? Or you might be somewhere in between. So this is the idea that you need to find out first, where am I and what implications does that have for my sustainable supply chain management? So here's an interesting list of practices which I find very helpful. So embedding sustainability in the culture of the company itself, very, very closely engaging with your suppliers, so knowing who your suppliers are, having a close look at what they're doing. Actually, recently, it's even working together with your suppliers, often in very close collaborative ways, in order to improve their environmental impact, to improve their social issues management. So if you're thinking, for instance, about labor issues like child labor or unpaid overtime, modern day slavery is a huge problem. So, but either one of those, you have to be very, very closely in touch with your suppliers. So have a look and a read through those different practices. I think they're very, very helpful and interesting orientation to find out what could be done if you are the one in charge of managing it from inside your focal company. And then, of course, of great help are those supply chain certifications and frameworks. And once again, this is just a kind of a shopping list for you folks to have a much, much closer look. So ISO 9000 very much focused on the management system itself, 14,000 on the environmental management system. So typically those two go together. EMAS is an alternative environmental management system standard. SAH 1000 looks mostly at labor rights, and the ISO 26000 is a guidance framework that helps to get to a more holistic idea of how to manage all of those topics. So these are very helpful and very important, but they need to have a much closer look. And then think about Deliveroo, for instance, or if you're in China or from China, Erlemer. Those kind of purely supply chain, almost kind of micro logistics companies. So micro in the sense of every one of the delivery drivers doing kind of very, very small size type of logistics activities, but many, many of them. So it's interesting to think there also, but because often they're hailed for the environmental impact. So oh, great, everybody's on their bicycle. Not so much anymore by now, I understand, but originally that was one of the main positive environmental impacts. So people don't get in their car to buy food somewhere else, or don't go to the restaurant by car, but rather somebody on a bike brings it to them. Great, environmental impact sounds super fun, and everything is happy, happy, joy, joy, right? But at the same time, so the environmental part seems to be good from that end. But on the other hand, a large issue are the social aspects of that. So think about those drivers being out there, often actually with very little social security and health related support on the street, between cars, any kind of weather. So there's a whole range of different issues on the social side coming up from it. So the idea is that supply chain management, managing that entire system, is not only managing all of the different parts, but it's also managing all of the different aspects. So environmental, social, economic could be one way of mapping those different aspects. Sustainability, responsibility, ethics could be another way of mapping those aspects. So then we're moving on to closing the loop. And if you're thinking about a system, a supply and demand system, in that circular way, we actually have to think about many, many more stakeholders than we usually would think about. So of course, most importantly, consumers are part of your supply and demand system. It is not that this is the job of marketing to think about consumer, to care about consumers. No, they are part of the system because they're a very central and elementary aspect that might make or break your efforts at closing the loop. If your customers, if the users of your product don't do their part in order to recycle the different parts of your product, for instance, back into the public recycling system, well, that's your problem. It's not your customer's problem. That's your problem if you want to have a sustainable supply chain that's closing the loop. So all of a sudden, the supply chain responsibility becomes much more forward-facing, looking at where do my products and my services actually go and what's being done with them. And that's very, very important. And think about one also in terms of that wider perspective of what we are responsible for as supply chain managers. Think about something that's very non-physical as a product. That's like an insurance policy. So an entirely like a product, a service, mixture between product and service that exists entirely in the financial realm. So how can you actually think about closing the loop for something like this? And one of the main issues for for life insurance, for instance, is that often people, for financial reasons, actually cancel them before they get the benefits out of a life insurance. The problem there then becomes that those products are being built in a way, configured in a way that they only make sense financially if you go all the way through. So there's huge inefficiencies, people losing loads of money and investments being made, which are just being basic, where the money is being put into the bin, if you don't let that insurance policy run through the end of its normal duration. So they actually, Police and Direct here in Frankfurt, they actually are focusing on how can we buy life insurances, not cancel them, buy life insurance of people who don't want to have them anymore, and change the person who benefits from the insurance, sell it to somebody else. Or sometimes they keep them themselves and they get the money that comes out of it. So another way of managing a supply and demand network and decreasing the inefficiencies in it and making sure that it's becoming a more sustainably managed network. And interesting here, it's actually financial sustainability that they care about, but also, of course, social sustainability, because if somebody pays into something that's meant to be their old age insurance, the money they live from, and then all of a sudden they cancel it and they basically stay there with nothing, that's a social problem as well. So typically those social, environmental, and economic, financial dimensions are very, very closely interlinked. Good. So in summary, we talked about this idea of getting to a responsible supply chain, and including to that the triple bottom line, the ethical performance, the responsibility and stakeholder performance, but also thinking about that progressive view of moving beyond the supply chain, but rather a supply and demand system. And very important, something that we didn't highlight here this time, is the role of small and medium-sized enterprises. So it's not only about those big corporate chains. SMEs play a huge role. And the idea is that we're actually able to manage that supply chain, respectively, that supply and demand network, so that it becomes a closed loop, something where all of the inefficiencies disappear, where we're not only less negative in terms of our impact, but we're actually regenerative, we are positive in our impact. And closing the loop plays an enormous role in that. And there's many different ways of closing the loop. We talked about circular economy, the closed loop supply chain itself, industrial ecosystem. We didn't talk about end-of-life design, but you can also take a product-based approach, design products that can only come out of a sustainable supply chain. If you want to know more about that, have a look at the book. And for now, that's me done. I'm very, very much looking forward to discussing some of those things just in a moment when we meet up in your class. Thank you.